What's up, freaks? This is just me, and today we're talking about the twisting rear double biceps pose, possibly also called the 3/4 rear double biceps or just the 3/4 back pose. I've also heard that. It's a variation of the standard back double biceps that's actually hit more from the side than from the back if you look at the way the legs and feet are positioned in this pose. The upper body is twisting to showcase the back development, and also the shoulders and arms are essential for this pose. On the screen, I present to you three very similar executions that vary basically only in the way of how much of a twist there is in the upper body. On the left, this is the most common way to strike the pose in my opinion. In the middle, it's a bit more of a closed off execution, and on the right, it's the exact opposite. The bodybuilder there is not leaning to the side as much. So we're gonna be looking at these poses in this video. I'm gonna show you pictures of competitors that strike the pose effectively or that pull it off really well at any point of their career. So that's it, let's go and start this video off, right? With the original Mr. Olympia, Larry Scott from the 60s, when bodybuilding was starting to take off, I guess. Larry Scott was an aesthetic icon, and you can definitely see that from these pictures, the way he's hitting the pose. He looks really good because the pose flatters his back development. He didn't have an amazing back in my opinion, but he had great arms, one of the best sets of all time, so this pose works pretty well for him. And there was also Dave Draper, the blonde bomber in the 1960s. He also looked pretty good in this pose, solid with that small waist and big back. A great classical physique. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find many photos of him. These aren't even real photos, so let's move on. There was a real icon in the 70s, an expert poser and 7-time Mr. Olympia, the Oak Arnold Schwarzenegger. This shot was among his most impressive and most iconic poses. He invented, or at least popularized, a lot of these non-mandatory poses. He had a very good back and one of the most impressive sets of biceps in bodybuilding history too. Here in these photos, you can once again admire the glorious aesthetic appeal of the oak. Arnold hid this pose very well because he knew how to showcase his strengths and hide his weaknesses, as we all know. His photos and his pose are among the most famous and celebrated in bodybuilding community of all time as well, so shout out to Arnold for this pose. And he also had a friend from the 70s and 80s, two-time Olympia champion Franco Colombo. Franco's back was one of the most impressive backs of the 80s for sure, even more impressive than Arnold's in my opinion, and he had a great twisting back double for sure. Maybe his arms don't look as awesome, but they look good enough. And his lats are so low and the back is so thickly developed, he just looks like a juggernaut in the back poses, don't you think so? He looks amazing. And here we have the 80s giant killer, Danny Padilla. His back wasn't as celebrated for his time, but he was so complete and looked so good in this pose anyway. He did a great job executing the twisting back double biceps. The angle of his arms, for instance, is just on the dot. He looks chiseled and statuesque, and he looks to have good separation in his muscle too. And now another amazing back of the 80s. It belongs to the Lion of Lebanon, Samir Banu. He also had beautiful posing routines, and he looked really good in the 3/4 pose. His back looks crazy developed and separated, and his delts and arms also look very shredded, if you ask me. So the Lion of Lebanon was a force to be reckoned with because he was both aesthetic and very powerful. But there was the arguably an even better back in the 80s, and that is Lee Haney's back. The Hercules Lee Haney won 8 Olympia titles, and it was largely by the virtue of his huge lats and great V-taper. He is the pose decent, and look at the thickness of his back. It's really impressive, although I don't think he flows as well in this pose. And he did battle on stage with the giant killer Rich Gaspari, who really succeeded in hitting this pose. He looks really surprisingly good in it as I see it. He definitely shouldn't look as impressive as Lee Haney, for instance, because he didn't have as good of a back, but he looks even better because he's doing such a great job hitting it. The thickness of his straps is impressing me a lot, and he has a great upper body overall, as well as the lower body. He wasn't particularly known for being the most aesthetic guy, but he fills this pose out very impressively. And there was also Mohamed Makawi, another short bodybuilder from the 80s mainly, but one of the most mind-blowing classic posers of all time. He was very innovative in his poses, so he didn't even hit that many actual poses, but he hit this one, and he looked aesthetically just on another level in it. He has the angle just correct, and he's got great lines and good separation, even though he's far from being the biggest. His back and arms look nicely shaped and well defined, so he looks great. And this is one photo of the 90s mass monster who never competed on a top level. It's Victor Richards. In my opinion, he looks crazy in this pose, at least in this one photo once again. Look at his arms and traps and lats, absolutely massive. So this pose translates surprisingly well for Victor Richards, and I like him in it because he looks like a force. And in the 90s, there was the Shadow Dorian Yates, who was a 6-time Olympia standout holder, and he had the best back of all time, or at least top 3, right? His lats and traps were so strong that this pose looks pretty good, even though Dorian doesn't have the best delts or arms by far. He looks really big and massive through the back, and he's also posing pretty well. Here we got him once again. This is a great representation of how thick his back actually was, although the arm development would be an area for improvement 100%. And here's one of Dorian's fellow competitors, Sean Ray. Sean had a great back, not nearly as big as Dorian, but he had a very symmetrical and perfect looking back. And he was a supreme poser. He really put a lot of effort into his routines, and it shows. His outline is on the money, and he looks like aesthetic perfection basically, just like in many other poses. Here he is again. His lower body in this pose looked really good too. He's sharp in the glutes, for instance, and he had a good waistline, of course, and well developed shoulders and arms. So that really makes the pose for him. He looks really great. But here's an absolute freak in this pose, 90s competitor Kevin Levrone. In this pose, he earns his nickname the Maryland Muscle Machine because he shows so much power and just looks very, very dominant in my opinion, like in his most muscular or side chest pose. Many fans claim that he is the best to ever hit the twisting back double biceps in history of bodybuilding. Maybe besides Arnold, right? This pose was tailor-made for Kevin because it puts on display all his standout muscle groups, his delts, triceps and biceps. He also looks great in other areas like the midsection, forearms, and even the back and legs, even though these were not his strongest points. He looks really good. Overall, he had a great talent for posing as well, so he does the pose justice and looks tremendous, in my opinion. He was also fond of hitting it. That was awesome. And we have 8-time Mr. O, Ronnie Coleman, Not known for artistic posing or great flow in his physique exactly, but at the start of his career, he hit the pose well. As we all know, Big Ron had a top 3 of all time worthy back biceps, legs, and possibly shoulders too. One blemish that I noticed on his physique was that his stomach wasn't as sucked in as I would like to see it, but otherwise, he's great in this pose. I have no idea why he didn't strike the pose more often. He was more impressive in it than 99.9% of other bodybuilders for sure. So that's definitely a pity, but what can you do? Mustafa Mohammed from the 2000s also hit this pose. He had a great lower body. You can notice that even in a pose like this, and his back doesn't look bad at all. I think his traps are good, and also the arms and shoulders. So overall, he's no slouch, but he's not exactly the best either. So let's look at someone else. This is Joel Stubbs, who had another top 3 backs of all time, along with probably Dorian and Ronnie, right? Maybe Phil as well. But anyway, he never became a real Olympia contender because of his lower body. I think he couldn't train his quads properly, that's why. But it was a huge loss of potential because his upper body was crazy, especially his back development. I don't like him in this pose as much though, to be honest. I don't think he's hitting it that well, but he's got good development. Next is Gustavo Bedell. He competed in the 2000s, and he didn't have a great outstanding back, and it doesn't look great in this pose, but he's not bad at all overall, I'm here to tell you. But admittedly, this is not one of the best entries in this video, although he looks very respectable, so let's move on. We have Baito Abaspor, who's from the 2010s and not known for his back, but he had a crazy lower body. You can see that even in a pose like this. And his arms also look pretty good. So I think overall he has good flow. So I wanted to include him. And here's a beastly bodybuilder from the 20s and 2010s, Dennis the Big Bad Wolf. He did not have the best back either, but just like Kevin Levrone before him, he took advantage of his impressive delts in this pose and made it work for him. He's posing very well and shows his physique in a flattering light. And it's not like his back looks underwhelming or anything. I think his inner back looks very thick, actually. Definitely nothing to laugh at. So the Big Bad Wolf deserves to be mentioned for sure. He looks very powerful. And then Phil Heath came onto the scene in the 2000s and later 2010s with his godlike back development, which really helped him in the mission of winning his 7 Olympia titles. He had a super proportionate and even aesthetically pleasing back, and he was also packing a lot of quality muscle there. Now, Phil is not a great poser, at least not in terms of hitting non-compulsory poses, but he gets this certain pose pretty decent. Let's take another look at him. Look at his lower body. His glutes and hams were always shredded. His back, as we already established, is such a great back, and Phil also boasts arguably the most impressive delts and complete arms of his generation. So even though you might not have expected Phil to hit this pose well, he pretty much does. And we all know who his main rival from the same era was, right? It was Kai Green. Despite his underdeveloped forearms and trapped muscles, he also sports a magnificent back double biceps pose, and the same goes for his twisting variation, in which I think Kai looks alien-esque as always. We don't even need to talk about the glutes, quads, and hams. And when we shift our sights to Kai's back development, he's got insanely low lat insertions and a great V-taper. Also freakishly peaky biceps, right? So not bad overall from the Predator. Another expert in the craft of bodybuilding posing looks great in this pose. But in the 2010 bodybuilding era, there was also the 212 division, and the 7-time champ of that division, James Flex Lewis. Flex might not have the smallest waist, that's quite apparent in these photos, but he had a very solid back. Note the thickness of it, and some great delts and arms. Plus, he's peeled in the leg department. He looks shredded overall, so not a bad shot for Flex Lewis at all. He hits it well. And another 212 IFBB pro who did battle on the Olympia stage with Flex. His name is Kamel El Garni. Hope I pronounced that right. He's a surprisingly graceful poser for such a rugged gentleman. He doesn't look mind-blowing in this pose, but decent enough for my list, I would say, because he looks pretty solid. And this is Justin Compton, who is from the mid-2000s, and I say this all the time, I don't know why this genetic phenom doesn't compete anymore. He had one of the freakiest arms and delts you've ever seen, which is really what you mostly need to pull off an impressive twisting back pose, right? In Justin's back double shot, his lats were always quite overwhelmed by the insane size of his shoulders, plus triceps, which are just incredible. But here, the lats look decent enough. The flow of this pose isn't as good for some reason though. I can't really put my finger on it. Something is just a bit odd. Maybe it's the balance and proportions are not right, but the muscle groups themselves are impressive, so Justin makes my list fairly easily. Next up, a less freakish, a more aesthetic physique of 2018, Mr. O, Sean Flexitron Roden. Look at him, not the best back, not the best arms. He was pretty inconsistent in that body part compared to his biceps on the left versus in the middle. What the hell happened to them? So, yeah, this pose technically shouldn't be among Sean's most impressive poses, but he absolutely nails the execution of it, and he had a great lower body. Notice the side quad and glute ham tan looks quite beautiful, even I dare to say, although that's quite weird, right? But he's super aesthetic in this pose and very peeled. Anyway, here is an aesthetic bodybuilder still going nowadays, Cedric McMillan. He's a phenomenal poser, and he hits this pose perfect. He has a good lower body, a great back, and top-notch arms. He looks so composed and well put together in this pose. He's showing insane details all over the place, and he likes to hit this pose to boot. And now we jump back to the more freaky, badass looking physiques for Rowley the Beast Winkler. Now, he doesn't look very balanced and pleasing in this twisting pose. His legs and lower part of the back are very far from matching his insane thickness through the traps and beefy delts and guns, but that at least gives him quite a unique look and a freaky one. He looks quite odd, but beastly. That's how I would sum up this pose for Rowley. And William Bonac, to be honest, looks a bit underwhelming in this pose. He has a world-class back and biceps, but in the 3/4 back double, for a reason that's quite unclear to me, he looks a bit too small in the upper body, and his insanely thick, lowly inserted lats seem to have quite almost disappeared. Now, he still looks decent. He has a good lower body for sure, but I would expect his upper back to look much better. This is quite astonishing to me. Maybe the Conqueror is just too narrow to hit this one effectively. I really don't know. But I still wanted to show him because his limbs look great. Moving on to 2019 Mr. Olympia Brandon the Beast Curry. I'm not sure if the angle of this pose is the best for him. I don't think so, but that's only a minor flaw. Other than that, Brandon's got a pretty good lower body, which is at its best from the side by far, And he's got a huge upper body with those big traps, shoulders, and arms. He looks like a cartoon character with the size of the upper body compared to his waistline. Here is Hadi Chupin. He's the Persian wolf, and out of the nowadays competitors, he doesn't have the most impressive, most standout back, but it's still a solid back development, right? But he definitely could use more size in his biceps and arms overall to make this pose more complete. But Hadi has a very well developed lower body that looks really good in this pose, seen from the side like this, so not bad for Hadi Chupin. This is Hunter Brada, who could use a bit more muscle maturity and separation and mass in his back. It doesn't look that great in this pose. At least he's hitting the pose effectively. He looks pretty nice in it, I guess. And I included Hunter in this video for the fact that he does the pose often, and in my opinion, he's got great potential and very, very large room for improvement. And his lower body looks exceptional as well as his arms. But Sergio Oliva Jr. looks better in this pose, in my opinion. He's another classic innovative poser of today's era. He gets the angle of his body just right, and his arms look pretty huge. His back looks a bit softer, not as impressive in this particular pose. I'm not saying he has a weak back, he doesn't. He's got a dense back in effect, and so overall, nice pose. Next, I want to showcase Justin Luis Rodriguez, who has a top 10 level back development nowadays. He's so thickly developed. He has a bit of a wider waistline, which is quite visible from this angle too, but he also has an eye-catching peaky set of biceps to basically make up for that. So he does more than a decent job in this twisting rear pose. But I feel like this man, James Hollingshead, looks even a bit more impressive, if that's even possible. Sure, he looks great through the traps in particular. Look at the density there. So an awesome back, one of the best of today's lineups in my opinion. The arms could maybe use a bit more mass, definitely, to match that insane back, but they don't look straight up undersized to me or anything. So good luck to James in perfecting this pose in the future. And there's also Rafael Brandao, more of a classic physique on this competitor, but he competes in the open class. He looks well composed and has a good pose, even though he could use more size and better conditioning as well, if we're being honest, right? I think he has great genetics and can make a lot of improvements to make this pose look even more aesthetic and impressive, because he's still young and fresh out of the oven. So good luck in making improvements to him. And here's Divine Wilson, who is a classic physique class competitor, and his back looks pretty well developed, and so do his shoulders and peaky biceps. He also looks really shredded in the quad department, which adds kind of a different look to his pose, making the pose look very complete. So keep your eye on Divine Wilson. And Brian Jones has a super good back for the classic physique division, and he looks pretty godly. Also in the legs, he looks surprisingly good, at least in my opinion. So some really good actual muscle development with great lines too on Brian Jones. And this is Wesley Vissers, and he probably has inferior back development to people such as Brian Jones, but he has the superior execution of the pose. He has this Arnold-esque way of striking the pose, and also a physique similar to the Oaks. Wes has really dominant lats, good biceps, and his trademark striated delts, which seem to display every single muscle fiber on its own. That's a really eye-catching feature, and I think it looks great. And this is Steve Lorius. He is disposed like a champ, if you ask me. He's also from the classic physique division, which you can notice in his small waist and crazy V-taper created by these lat muscles. The arms are also very separated, and I feel like, as a whole, his twisting rear double biceps position, uh, he has probably the best out of all classic physique competitors. Steve brings a real aesthetic, classic, appealing package with great conditioning. But at this point of his career, Chris Bumstead might look even better due to the mind-blowing improvements he's made to his back since his debut, which is probably largely the reason why Chris won multiple Olympia titles in classic physique. So he does in fact have a fantastic pose. Look at his legs, look at his back. As I said, it's much improved, the thickness is there. Seabum's arms are not his strongest body parts, we all know that, but in this pose I don't think it's a problem at all. I don't know if I'm looking at this kind of wrong, but to me Chris's biceps here look really good. That's quite puzzling, but either way I gotta give it up for Seabum. This pose is absolutely reminiscent of the golden era. He also hits it very, very effectively and well. Alright guys, that's gonna be all for this video. Let us know down in the comment section below your opinion on the twisting or 3/4 rear double biceps pose. I really like this pose and the way it looks when delt and arm dominant bodybuilders with good back development do it, because in my opinion it makes them look muscle bound and beast like at the same time as really pleasing to look at. So a great pose in my mind. So what do you think? And what did you think about this video too? Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to watch some twisting rear double biceps pose videos and also like and subscribe. Enjoy the rest of your day.